The reason I got into the business in the first place was pretty accidental. I graduated from college. I'd had a couple of experiences with people with disabilities prior to that. My sister had a friend who had a brother with Down syndrome, and it was very unusual in the 1960s to see people with Down syndrome anywhere because families had not really the choice, but the dilemma of either, if they had a child with Down syndrome or any other kind of significant intellectual disability, they could place their child at a state institution, or they could keep them home and be kind of shunned by their neighbors. They weren't allowed into public schools. If there were public schools available, they were separate. They looked very much like institutions. And so it was very unusual to meet somebody with Down syndrome. Just kind of in the general public situation. So anyway, so I got to meet her brother, and then I had another friend who took me to, he volunteered for Special Olympics. And that was kind of a program that was just starting up. I mean, we're talking the late 1960s, 1969, 70, 71. And he took me to his volunteer activity with Special Olympics. So I was kind of interacting with folks with disabilities, but that's really the only connection I had. Actually, when I took the job with the institution in Minnesota, I had 2 job offers on the same day, and one was delivering stationery goods for like a whopping $4.50 an hour, or I could work in an institution as a part-time janitor for $2.20 an hour, and for some, who knows why, took the position of the institution. And I needed money because I had traveled to Minnesota on a vacation and I only had enough money to get there. I needed money to get back home. And so why I took that job, I have no idea. When I entered the field in 1973, we were doing things that today would be considered abuse. In those days, they were sanctioned by the school districts, they were sanctioned by the doctors, they were recommended as support strategies. So timeout rooms, for example. I remember going into a classroom in 1980 when I first moved to Jackson County and watching a teacher spray ammonia water into the eyes of a young student. It was watered down. It wasn't straight ammonia, obviously. That would have caused a horrible. But it was still, it hurt. And that was a sanctioned strategy by both the school district and the behavior specialist that was overlooking it. And the presumption was that that would teach the person, kind of provide a negative consequence so the person wouldn't engage in that kind of behavior again. We used electricity. There were electric grid things that were built where people would actually get shocked if they engaged in a behavior that was inappropriate. There was compliance training, and the 3rd level of compliance training, basically today we definitely consider it abuse. The 1st level, very good direct instruction. The 3rd level was literally 2 people on either side of me, standing me up, sitting me down 20 times in a row, and then giving me a different direction, like pick up a pencil. And the idea was that I would get so used to obeying the command that I would obey the next command. Kind of like revving up a car and setting it down and running it across the floor. Those things today all would be considered abuse. Today our strategies have improved by light years. Technology we're just scratching the surface of technology. I think the things that we consider to be good strategies today may very well be considered the same way the strategies that I engaged in 30, 35, 40 years ago. They'll be viewed in the same way as being kind of archaic and sort of a Neanderthal in approach, that our strategies can improve that much more over time. Every time we've placed a ceiling, I think, on people with disabilities, we have been wrong. We've been surprised. All of the times in my career where I thought, well, this is it. This is the best we're ever going to be able to do. We've exceeded those every time. So I don't believe that there's any ceiling between the same life I have and a life a person with disabilities could experience. Living Opportunities, when I came here in 1988, was a nice little organization. We had about a $650,000 a year budget, had about 35 staff. The board of directors had already been introduced to the idea of supported employment. They already had what the precursor of a supported living service. They wanted to do that kind of work, and they've been trying to. The previous leader, Jesse Martin, had been trying to make that happen and struggling, like many organizations were all around the state, to get it done, and just having trouble getting it done. So the organization was kind of set up. It was financially stable. It had a good reputation. It was much smaller than it is today. I mean, $650,000 compared to $8 million, and 35 staff compared to 150 today. But it was the right place. It was the right vehicle to try to get this done. I didn't have to convince a lot of people that, finding a regular job in the community was not an outlandish idea to them. But what we faced was a staff that had not bought into the idea. So we had staff who didn't believe. We had a board that was interested and definitely willing to take a shot at it if we could pull it off. But we didn't have a staff that was really willing to believe it. And we still believed as an organization at that point in time that the future was a lot more kind of more group living facilities, and thus the name. So the first challenge was kind of changing the thinking and attitude of staff. And that really came through a lot of discussion around business practices, a lot of discussion around just basic mission. I mean, having people look at their own lives and ask themselves, what would you want in your life? And nobody said, well, I want to go to this place where there's only people with disabilities and kind of hang out and watch movies. So they all said, I want a job, I want an apartment or place to live. So when they reflected on their own lives, that's really kind of the beginning of the change to the kind of thinking, I think, that's typical and characteristic of Living Opportunities as an organization today. Originally, the vision for Living Opportunities was to create kind of recreate a miniature institution on a single piece of property. In fact, they had their eyes on this Valley View property that we're sitting at now. And there are actually designs, architectural designs, drawings, that show kind of a segregated work activity center, which is what we had from 1983 to 1988. And exclusively is what we had. But there were also houses all along the property, and they owned property all the way to Sunrise and then all the way back to the Roxanne Grange. So they had a big chunk of property, and they were going to kind of build this miniature institution on it. And so the thinking changed over time, that it was very important to separate that kind of congregate living situation from these sheltered workshops. At least that was the precursor to having a regular life. That was the first step, in effect. So I think the mission statement was about 1.5 pages long, and it went on and on and on, and nobody could possibly say it ever. I mean, you'd have to read it, and it would take a few minutes, to get it done. So one of the goals, and I think one of the primary goals of leadership, actually, is to take complex things and make them as simple as you can so that they are easily repeated, easily understood, can be repeated by other people. And that's what kind of led us to shrinking our mission statement to something so simple as living in the same neighborhoods that you and I would want to live in, working for the same companies you and I would want to work for, and just engaging in the same kind of experiences that anybody else would engage in. That is so deceptively simple, and we are still so far from achieving so much of that. But it was a long process. It took probably 6 or 8 years of conversation to kind of move to that super simple view of what we ought to be doing. And once we did that, it's like the whole thing gelled. I mean, people got it. You could hear any of our staff repeat that anytime, anywhere. It was, and people could really buy into it because they could relate to it. It was about their lives. You know? That's what made it so powerful, I think. The very first week that I worked here, nobody really knew me. And a board member and I decided that a couple of pieces of siding on the building needed to be replaced. So I brought in my tool belt, my hammer, and whatnot. And Bill had done construction pretty much all of his life. So we're replacing siding. So that's how I met probably 2/3 of the staff that worked at Living Opportunities. They just walked by and assumed I was a maintenance guy working with this other guy they didn't know very well either. So they were really shocked, like 2 weeks in to discover that I ran the place. But I think, in a way, that kind of attitude is important. And I think you see it throughout the company because for the longest time, I remember, actually, I thought about that story a lot as we were hiring leaders and having conversations with leaders here. It's so important that the people who lead our organization understand at the most basic level what happens in terms of supporting people with disabilities. And they're willing to roll up their sleeves and do whatever it takes to get things done that day. And that includes substituting for any staff person, being able to do direct supports and so forth. And for a long time, we actually made it a point of making sure that managers had some time doing direct support because they needed that kind of connection to really, really understand what we did.